This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality.
The first time Ava saw Angelo naked was on their wedding night, 11 May 1860, when he strode into their bedroom, accidentally revealing to her startled eyes that from the waist down he had the hindquarters of a stallion. Now, Angelo was no brute. He was a miller, and this was in his house in Carco, Sicily. He had knocked gently, and he had thought he heard her whisper, "Come in." But when he opened the door, the room was ablaze with candles, and Ava was still on her knees at prayer at the bedside. She lifted her head and saw Angelo was wearing only the fancy shirt he had married in, saw those supreme flanks, hocks, fetlocks, and horny-soled feet. The blood drained from her face. For a moment she wavered and flickered. Then she murmured the last words of her Hail Mary, blessed herself, and stood up. "Amen," said Angelo, taking her cool hand in his. "I've something to tell you." "Your legs," she began. "Remember," Angelo broke in, "God created horses, too. In fact, horses are amongst the most noble of God's creatures. Horses aren't soaked in blood. They don't have fangs or claws. They don't kill, and they don't eat other horses. Horses are peaceful, more peaceful than men, not cowardly like sheep or stupid like oxen, but serene and powerful. God created horses just to show us what he could do in the way of power and beauty. And when he finished, he admired his handiwork. He admires horses. Horses have strength and grace and intelligence. Horses have courage and endurance. Horses have fidelity. Besides, I'm not holy, not your bottom half," she began again. "There have been other unions, but they were horrible mismatches and produced mongrel beasts, harpies, manticores, bull-headed minotaurs. Only Chiron, the centaur, was a scholar and teacher. Besides, as I said, your thing," she began once more. "Don't let the great size frighten you." His voice was gentle, almost complacent. "A horse?" she asked, astounded. "A stallion," he said. He was quite frank about it. Sicily was a beautiful land where strange and terrible things happened every day of the week. "I will not bed down with a horse." Ava snatched her hand from his and ran around to the far side of the bed and stood there watching him. "It's been a long day, and we're both tired," Angelo said, keeping quite still so as not to frighten her. "So? And when we're tired, we should go to sleep." "I'm never going to sleep. Certainly not with you," she said, her voice trembling. "You look so fierce," Angelo remarked, simply to make her feel better. He had begun to stroll very slowly down the room on his side of the bed. "You look, not tonight, not tomorrow night, not ever." "Wild," he continued, "like an animal. I like that, of course, an animal." He paused at the foot of the bed and smiled at her. "You're a magnificent woman." Ava had almost started to say something, but now she hesitated, her lips still parted, distracted by what he had just said. "A splendid woman," he continued. "It's hard to believe that when I first saw you, your legs were so thin, I thought they would snap in two. You were always running after your aunt, and everywhere she went, you would follow her, trotting after her like a foal." "Because I was 10 years old," she protested. "And now you are a woman of 17, with beautiful teeth and strong round arms, and I imagine sturdy legs. We will be superb at making love." Ava clapped her hands over her ears. Angelo laughed. He praised her hair, told her it shimmered like a river at midnight, then spoke quietly about her luminous eyes, her gleaming shoulders, her something breasts, and so on downward, dropping his voice softer and softer, so that Ava, who had opened her fingers just a bit to hear him, had to open them still more until, straining to catch his last words, she forgot herself and said, "What? What flower? Stop! Don't come any closer." "Calm yourself," Angelo said. He seated himself on the low chest, which stood against the wall by the foot of the bed. "How long do you plan to stand over there?" he asked. "As long as I want to." "Of course. But why not sit on the bed? Philomena scented the sheets with lavender just for us. Ava seated herself guardedly on the edge of the bed, watching him all the time. "This is a pretty room, isn't it?" he said, looking around. "I whitewashed it myself a week ago." In fact, it was a pretty room. In addition to the bed, there was a low dresser, a rushed-bottom chair, and in the space between two shuttered windows, there was a washstand with an oval mirror hung above it. Angelo said, "The candles look nice, too. I didn't expect you to light them all at once, but they do look nice, like a church at High Mass. Maybe that's why I'm so sleepy." "Churches always make me sleepy," he confessed. "Or maybe it's my age. I'm no child, and at my age—" "What are you doing?" Ava cried, jumping up. "I'm unbuttoning my shirt. I'm going to bed." "Bed? What bed? Stop!" But Angelo was already on his feet, rampant, and now he threw off his shirt, letting it billow onto the chair. And there he stood naked, while a dozen shadows of him reared and plunged on the whitewashed wall at his back. Ava had started to cover her eyes, but it was too late. Now she simply looked at him, and the candle flames grew calm again, and the shadows grew still. His flesh was a rich chestnut color, and his hair was black. Black on his head, black in his beard, black everywhere. His shoulders gleamed. At the base of his throat there was a little hollow filled with golden shadow, and on his chest the pattern of hair spread like the wings of a crow. His navel was deep and dark. His legs, those splendid stallion legs. His flanks so smoothly muscled that as he walked the flesh shimmered in the short downy hairs on his rump, the curling hairs on his thigh, the tassel-like hairs on his fetlocks, all sparkled like coal, and in the center, of course, as if darkness of night had taken beastly shape. But Angelo was blowing out the candles one by one, and it was becoming harder to see. He stopped when there was only the solitary chamber stick burning on the chest of drawers. Then he leapt into bed, stacked 2 pillows behind his back, and sat with the sheets pulled up to his chest. He looked at Ava. "I'm going to sleep," he said. "I'm not sleepy." "Would you like to rest on top of the covers?" She came and sat at the edge of the bed, her back to him. "Give me your hand," he said. "What are you going to do?" she asked, half turning. "I'm going to sit here like we used to sit on the bench in your aunt's garden. What did we ever do there? Now give me your hand." "All right," she said. She lay back on the covers against him and got comfortable. "But don't try to reason with me," she added. "Of course not." He put his arm around her and took her hands. "Now that we're married, there's a secret I can tell you." "I already know your secret," she said. "Now listen. This is what you don't know. When a man of my kind, a man of my nature, when a man who is part stallion makes love to a woman, she inherits 3 gifts. Everything I ever inherited is in that ugly chest. These gifts come because he makes love to her. They come with his love-making, and with his—" Angelo hesitated, hunting for the proper word. "What 3 gifts?" "Her childbirths will be easy, her milk will be sweet, and she will be beautiful forever." "Angelo, you liar!" She laughed. "These talents will be yours by nature," he continued, undeflected, "and they'll be passed on to our daughters and their daughters too, if we make love often enough. And the boys, what would they inherit? My sons will be like me, of course." His breath was soft behind her ear. He went on talking in a voice gentle and resonant, and even dreamy, speaking of his father and mother and the village where they lay, which was deep in the heart of Sicily. And in the hour or so that followed, he told her about those spirits hidden in the hills and fields around the village, told her about the patron saints and beasts, and while his voice grew even sleepier, he talked about his relatives, not all of whom were horse, for one was a famous tree, and another was a rock, and there was an aunt. "Yes?" Ava said, turning to him. "Go on, I'm listening." But Angelo was asleep. She turned all the way around and crept cautiously over the covers to study his face and his beard, his lips, the hard wrinkles at the corner of his eyes. A handsome man, she thought. His breathing was deep and slow, for he was fast asleep, but the guttering candle made the shadows on his face waver as if he were stirring and about to wake up. So Ava lay on the covers and listened to his soft, slow breathing, and watched the candle flicker out and strove to keep awake. Angelo awoke early and found Ava sleeping like a statue at his side atop the bed covers. He gazed at her in the milky light, at her flushed cheeks and parted lips. How young she was! Cautiously lifted his hand to caress her, but changed his mind and slipped softly out of bed. In the dim hall he pulled on his work pants and boots, then groped his way down the dark stairs to wash in the courtyard. He hoped that a brisk walk on the hills would relieve the painful energy compressed in his legs, his thighs. He pulled on his shirt, flung open the gate, and abruptly a horse and rider materialized out of the gray air. "He has landed," the rider told him. "Ah," said Angelo. "Yesterday at Marsala." Angelo wheeled and ran back in the courtyard, pounded once on the stable door, once on the kitchen door, then clattered up the stairway to his bedroom. "Garibaldi has landed at Marsala, and I'm going to join him," he cried, throwing off his shirt. Ava reached for the latch on the window shutters, staring at him. Angelo sat on the bed to pull off his boots and pants, then flung on his wedding shirt and strode into the hall. He returned clothed in a fancy shirt and his best pair of velveteen pants. "I've waited all my life for this," he said, pulling on his boots. He crossed the room to Ava, who stood by the open window, still staring at him. "You're crazy," she said soberly. Angelo took both her hands in his and kissed her lips. "Remember that I love you," he told her. "Garibaldi is an animal, a beast," she said, her voice rising. He laughed. "Then he has come to the right place." "We will die," she wailed. "We have always died, but today you should be singing." Ava wrenched her hands from his and began to beat her fists against his chest, shouting, "Go, go, 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 go." She had broken into sobs. "I've never been so happy," he said, putting his arms around this sturdy young woman who wept for him. Angelo kissed the crown of her head and rushed down the stairway to the dining room. There he tossed back the lid of the black oak chest, peeled away the linens and flannels, and came up with an antique bird gun. Then he strode into the yard, pulling a heavy pistol from under the big flower pot by the door, and was shouting "Philomena" as he crossed to the stable where the boy had saddled the gelding. He mounted, took the bundle of food which Philomena handed up to him, leftovers from the wedding wrapped in oilcloth, then went out through the gate at a canter, leaving the boy at the stable door, Philomena in the middle of the yard, his uncles and half-brothers asleep indoors, and his virgin bride face down in her bed, beating her pillow.
That was The Goddess in Love with a Horse, written and read by Eugene Mirabelli. This story is an excerpt from the novel Renato by Eugene Mirabelli, Macpherson and Company, 2020.
Viviamo nei lieti conici che la bellezza infiora e là fuggevo l'ora s'inebria voluta viviam nei dolci fremiti che suscita l'amore poiché quello che ha al cuore ogni poteva amore fra i calici più caldi baciava.
Hello, Gene. We're happy to have you on our podcast, and thanks for inviting us into your home.
Oh, I'm delighted to see you both.
We just heard the first few pages of your novel Renato, with an exclamation mark. The Goddess in Love with a Horse is the title of book one of the novel. Can you give us a quick overview of the whole story and its three parts?
Yeah, sure. Actually, the story existed as three separate books, and The composition of this one required sort of reconfiguration of the whole of each of the individual novels.
Mm-hmm.
As this was put together, and I confess it was really the publisher's idea to do this, we have essentially now the birth of the narrator, the birth of the central character, and his ancestry. We begin over 100 years before he's born, and we have his genealogy in this first novel, The Goddess in Love with a Horse. In the second novel, Renato the Painter, that's the main body of this trilogy, really. Renato's a painter, and we find him in his 70th year trying to get a name for himself, such as he had when he was a younger man. He's making his last assault, really, on one of the better streets in Boston that has all the art galleries on it. Things don't turn out quite as well as he hoped, but he does get his exhibit, and we see his whole life, really, in his 70th year. The last novel is Renato after Alba. Alba is his wife, and Renato's wife has died, and he's in grief. Call it the trajectory of the novel, and it does make a very interesting trajectory, as a matter of fact. I hadn't intended it that way, but that's the way it came out.
Well, that's a rather unusual thing. 3 novels published separately, then coming together as one. So it was Bruce McPherson's idea? Tell us more about that.
He felt that they deserved more attention and that bringing them together would do that. As it turned out, Bruce was right in terms of marketing and in terms of response. The reviews were excellent. These 3 together, they're not the only books I wrote. And furthermore, the figure that I just read about, Angelo, Angelo's story is mirrored in a different way by a goddess, essentially a reincarnation of Venus or Aphrodite, who's actually working in a bordello. And the 2 families migrate to this country, and they actually marry on the dock in Boston at the end of the 19th century. These 2 different family genealogies come together. Anyway, there is art and there's commerce, and they happen to cross at this particular point in this particular way. And as I say, it worked out in one fashion, but I feel very ambivalent about it, obviously. The third novel was one that was wholly unplanned. My wife of over 50 years passed suddenly away. I was bereft, and my life was filled with grief. I had been writing short stories. I stopped writing. As a matter of fact, Renato the Painter, that book was in essentially manuscript form, ready for publication. I took it and I tossed it into the garage, which is the first stop on the way to the trash. But then I had talked to McPherson about the book. We got in touch with each other. I forget exactly how that came about. He went over the book page by page and loved it and brought it out. And then, after a couple of years, of course, I wanted to get back to the way I used to feel when I was happily married and writing. But every time I sat down to write, I would have grief-stricken thoughts. And I knew I did not want to write a memoir. So what I did was take the last book, Renato. It's a very spacious book. And Renato's life is so large that it made it very easy to take all the elements from that book and simply put him in the position that I had been in. And indeed, grief is universal and grief is unique. So it worked for that final book. But as I say, the main body of this, and by the way, I should also add, I could never sit down and write a depressing book. It would depress me to do that. So one of the interesting tasks in writing Renato after Alba was to make it entertaining. I hope it is. I think it is. It seems to have worked very well. But the trajectory over the 3 is really the story of Renato the Painter.
One review I read said that Renato rivals grand opera for passion and plot. So, novel as opera. What are your thoughts about that?
It really made me rethink what I was doing. I was a little late, of course, but, that critic, he's actually written the introduction to the book. And he's sort of right. He's sort of right. I never thought of it that way, but I grew up, the background music was opera. That's what was going on in my family's house. And, yeah, sort of. I think he means dramatic and Italian.
Yeah.
Italian-American specifically.
In the excerpt we just heard, a big part of a reader's delight is the way you step outside ordinary reality, the kind of thing we always like on the Strange Recital. We might call it magical realism. Mythology enters everyday life. What was your inspiration for that?
That happened a long time ago, and I really began writing realist fiction. But I often wondered whatever happened to those gods that used to populate Greece and Italy and Sicily. And they were marvelous creatures and very interesting people, it seemed to me.
Yeah.
And I thought of that, and I wanted to do it. But can you really have a man who's half stallion? Well, at the time I was reading comic strips, ordinary newspapers, and there was a marvelous one called Bloom County, in which one of the characters was a penguin. And it fascinated me that this penguin and these people were talking to... One of the fellows in the comic strip was a Vietnam veteran in a wheelchair. I mean, that was very realistic. And the penguin was real. And I figured, I can get away with anything. The thing is to do it. And that's what I did, as a matter of fact. That's how it came about.
Did you take that approach throughout all three parts of the book? Into Renato's life as well as his ancestors?
Not quite. What I've always known from family stories, and the family stories would come from my mother about her family, and her family really was the springboard for the characters in Renato the Painter and so on. As my mother would tell stories, the further back she went in family history, the more fantastic the stories got. And I've noticed that with other people. Oh, yes, when they talk about their parents, it's one thing. When they talk about their grandparents, it's something else. And then they have their ancestry, where they're related to Indians or thieves or buccaneers and so on and so forth. So the further back you go, which is at the beginning of this trilogy, of course, it begins in 1860 and it ends in, Boston, the contemporary times. So the magic gradually drops out of it. It becomes more and more realistic as it goes on.
One of the keys to the tone of this work is the way your third-person narrator slyly comments occasionally. A couple of examples. A stallion, he said. He was quite frank about it. Sicily was a beautiful land where strange and terrible things happened every day of the week. And then later he spoke quietly about her luminous eyes, her gleaming shoulders her something breasts, and so on downward. These are subtle narrator intrusions, but they help create the warmth and humor that makes this scene work so well. So, what's my question? I guess it's this. How calculated is that narrative voice, or does it just naturally flow?
The voice that you're quoting is, of course, Renato. Not Mirabelli, but Renato. And Renato is the narrator of all three of these works. Renato gradually became a figure I really, really liked. He's, maybe I should correct that, actually. Renato, you wouldn't want to be married to him, although he's an interesting guy. He's a very opinionated person. And he gives a first-person narrative in Renato the Painter. He's a funny person, yes, and he's full of life, yes. But people who are full of life are liable to have affairs on the side, disappoint their children, or have illegitimate children, or things like that. And that's not me. That's not me at all.
The excerpt ends with Angelo going off to join Garibaldi in the war that unified Italy. Is Italian history a large element in the story as a whole?
Well, it's certainly an element in the story as a whole, but it's background, and the information that anybody would need as a reader is provided in the book by the characters themselves.
You had a distinguished career as a professor and have written other novels and numerous articles. Tell us more about yourself, and are you working on anything now?
Well, about whether or not I'm working on anything now, I am, but I don't know that I'll finish it. I'm an older writer. I'm a very old writer. And I am, however, at that point where I'm perfectly willing to leave something unfinished if I'm called away. As for what I've done, In my life, well, I don't know that I can sum it up in a sentence or two. I'm kind of surprised to find myself here, actually, at 92, or actually, this is my 93rd year, I suppose, if we're counting. I've spent a lot of time writing, that's true. A lot of it was writing. I began writing interviews with people when I was very, very young, and I worked out of a telephone booth claiming to be a journalist for the Boston Globe or some other newspaper in Boston. I lied, but I found that people liked to be interviewed, and so they would put up with me. I'd get the interview, and then if I was fortunate, I could sell it. As a matter of fact, that was my first professional work. Later, I did book reviewing. I was a graduate student down at Johns Hopkins at the time. And usually I did manual labor to earn extra money. But at that time, in Baltimore, where I was, the manual labor was done by African Americans. So I wound up writing book reviews for the Baltimore Sun. I actually wrote a dissertation at Harvard University, if you can believe it. And that's the way it goes. I like writing. I think, however, it's a secret. I'd like to have been a painter, and that's why I wrote Renato the Painter.
Well, one last question. I saw in one of your photos you're wearing a Greek fisherman's cap, just like the one I wear. So, is there a connection between literature and the Greek fisherman's cap?
Well, apparently so. Apparently so. You've got one. I've got one. We're both writers. Why not?
I think Pinter might have had one.
Thanks, Gene. This has been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you.
It's certainly been a pleasure for me to have you both here.
Guess I better get myself a new hat.
Yeah, maybe one of those freak fisherman's hats. This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was an excerpt from La Traviata by Giuseppe Verdi. This is episode 23081.